On a humid August morning in 1855, in Savannah, Georgia, a child stood on an auction block, and not a single person wanted to buy him. Marked as cursed and dangerous, his pale skin and colorless eyes signaled a bearer of bad luck that no plantation owner would risk bringing onto their property. The bidding started at $20, then fell to $15, then $10. Finally, at just $5, her fan was raised by one woman. Out of what she called Christian charity, a widow who owned 4,000 acres 12 miles outside the city, Margaret Dunor, paid $12. Her generosity was applauded by the crowd. What they did not know was that for 3 years, Margaret had been searching for a child exactly like this one. What they could not have imagined was that over the next 14 years, 73 people would disappear on her property, their fates documented in ledgers that local authorities allegedly burned in 1861. But one ledger survived, hidden in a foundation wall, discovered during highway construction in 1959. Inside were bloodline charts, measurements, and something called the Purification Project. Before the story continues of what happened to that albino boy and the hidden compound where Margaret conducted her experiments, I need to ask you something. Hit that notification bell and subscribe to this channel because we uncover the mysteries that history tried to bury. And please, leave a comment telling us what state or city you are listening from. We want to know where our audience is hearing these dark stories. Now, let me take you back to that sweltering afternoon when a widow's terrible vision began to take shape. Like a physical weight, the summer heat in Savannah pressed down on the crowd gathered near the waterfront slave market. Alone as always, Margaret Dunor arrived in her carriage, a massive woman whose size commanded attention in an era when such girth signaled wealth and power. She had been a widow for 13 years at 47 years old, running her late husband's plantation with an iron will that made neighbors wary and overseers nervous. But her business acumen or her appearance was not what truly set Margaret apart. It was the library she had assembled over the past decade. Over 300 books on animal husbandry, anatomy, and natural philosophy, with a particular focus on hereditary science and breeding techniques. Perhaps 11 years old, the boy brought to the platform that day was so thin his ribs showed through his shirt, but it was his coloring that made the crowd fall silent. Almost translucent in the harsh sunlight appeared his skin. Sparse and white blonde was his hair, and a pinkish-gray quality that seemed to look through people rather than at them was held in his eyes. His discomfort was struggled to be hidden by the auctioneer, a professional named Cyrus Peton. Without his usual enthusiasm, he announced, Lot 47. Male child approximately 11 years from the Hutchinson estate near Augusta. As you can see, a particular condition he has, albinism. The word was not spoken aloud, but everyone understood. In 1855 Georgia, among both white and enslaved communities, such children carried heavy superstitious weight. Many believed they brought crop failures, that they could see ghosts, that they were marked by divine punishment. Common enough on plantations was the mixing of African and European ancestry, but an uncomfortable ambiguity that defied the racial categories upon which the entire system depended was created by albinism. Not a single hand rose when bidding opened at $20. Repeatedly, Peton lowered it until reaching $5. Still nothing. Away turned people, some making signs against evil. That was when with deliberate slowness, Margaret raised her fan, her expression serene. To stare, the crowd turned. $5 to Mrs. Dunor, Peton said quickly, relieved to have any bid. Going once, going twice, sold. Margaret stood, with theatrical generosity opening her purse. Loudly she announced, I will pay $12 for the poor child. It is our Christian duty to care for those whom others reject. Approvingly, several women nodded. God bless you, Mrs. Dunor, an elderly gentleman called out. With a gracious smile, she acknowledged the praise, the very picture of benevolent Christianity. But with the cold calculation of a naturalist examining a rare specimen, her eyes studied him as the boy was led to her carriage. Finally, she had found what she needed, subject zero for her purification project. Pressed into the corner of the carriage during the journey to Belmont Plantation sat the boy, whose previous owners had called him Thomas. Nothing was said to him by Margaret, but a leather journal was open and observations were begun by her: his approximate age, the specific shade of his skin and hair, indifferent like the color of his eyes, the size of his hands and feet. Methodically she worked, occasionally looking up to measure him with her gaze before returning to her notes. For over 20 years, Augustus, Margaret's driver, had worked for the Dunor family. His jaw was tight, his shoulders were tense. Not to question what Margaret did, he had learned long ago. Among the enslaved community in Chatham County, Belmont had a reputation. Simply vanished were people who went there, not escaped, because word usually spread about runaways being captured. As if they had never been born, these people ceased to exist. Toward a part of Belmont that Thomas would soon know too well, the carriage rolled through Pine Forest, a collection of buildings hidden nearly a mile from the main house, accessible only by a narrow road through thick woods. Using materials purchased in small quantities from different suppliers across 3 states, these structures had been built between 1843 and 1852. Immediately after completion, the workers who constructed them had been sold, dispersed to plantations so far apart they would never meet to compare stories. In front of the largest building, when Augustus stopped the carriage, Margaret climbed down and Thomas was beckoned to follow. Unlike anything he had ever seen was the interior. Clean pine floors, whitewashed walls, glass windows. To a small room containing a bed with an actual mattress, a chair, a table with a basin, and a shelf, Margaret led him. "This will be your room," she said, her cultured voice carrying no warmth. "Adequate food, clothing, and shelter will be provided to you. In return, with certain procedures you will cooperate: medical examinations, measurements, observations. Do you understand?" Nothing except that survival meant obedience was understood by Thomas, who nodded. "Can you read?" His head was shaken. "Can you write?" Another shake. "You will be taught," Margaret said with satisfaction. "To read, write, and understand natural philosophy, you will learn. Tomorrow, these lessons begin. About your lessons, you may ask questions, but about anything else you see or hear, you will not ask questions. Without permission, you will not speak to others. You will not attempt to leave. Well, you will be treated if you obey. Severe punishments will be if you disobey. Do you understand?" Again Thomas nodded, his thin body trembling. From the outside, when she left, Margaret locked the door. For a long time, Thomas stood motionless before finally sitting on the edge of the mattress. He could not lie down. Instead, with his back against the wall, he sat, knees drawn to his chest, waiting for whatever would come next. In the cool basement of another building, Margaret lit oil lamps and a journal was opened. In ink her pen was dipped and in neat, precise script she began writing. August 17, 1855. At Belmont, Subject 0 has arrived. For the purification project, initial observations suggest excellent quality. In all physical characteristics, pure albinism is evident. Tomorrow, begin preliminary measurements, followed by educational assessment. The foundation upon which all subsequent phases will build is represented by Subject 0. This acquisition validates 13 years of preparation if theories prove correct. For another hour, she continued writing, documenting every detail she had observed about Thomas. To Margaret, a person he was not. He was the key to unlocking what she believed were the secrets of human heredity, and for a role so disturbing that when the truth finally emerged, it would haunt Chatham County for generations, she would spend the next 4 years preparing him. A rigid schedule that Margaret enforced with absolute consistency was followed by Thomas's days at Belmont. At 6 o'clock each morning he woke when Margaret herself unlocked his door, a routine she maintained to establish her complete authority. With measuring tape and notebook, she would enter, recording his height against marks on the door frame. On a scale imported from Philadelphia, once per week she weighed him. That lasted over an hour. Once per month she performed a complete physical examination, measuring every aspect of his development with clinical precision. Breakfast was received by Thomas after morning measurements, cornmeal mush, occasionally supplemented with milk or molasses. For optimal growth, Margaret had calculated precise caloric intake necessary. At 7 o'clock, his education began. A tutor had been hired by Margaret, a nervous young man from Savannah named Christopher Vance, who came twice weekly to teach arithmetic, reading, and writing. He believed he was participating in progressive research testing whether enslaved children could learn academic subjects. About Margaret's broader project, he had no idea. An exceptional student was proven by Thomas, absorbing information with impressive speed. By the end of his first year, complex texts could be read by him, in clear handwriting he could write, and advanced mathematics could be performed by him. Pleased Margaret seemed, though her satisfaction manifested as clinical approval rather than warmth. From her library, she assigned him books, anatomical texts with detailed illustrations, agricultural manuals about livestock breeding, natural philosophy books discussing variation and heredity. But during Margaret's private lessons, the true purpose of his education became clear. Across from Thomas in one of the compound school rooms, Margaret would sit, anatomy charts hanging between them, and her theories she would explain. How characteristics passed from parents to children was shown by her, charts documenting horse breeding were displayed, and how desirable traits could be concentrated through careful selection was explained. Then to human heredity she would transition, her voice never changing tone. Her belief that races represented different developmental stages was explained by her, that characteristics like intelligence and beauty were inherited and could be improved through selective breeding. With his face impassive, Thomas listened, his pale eyes fixed on the charts. That interrupting brought sharp rebukes, he had learned. Margaret never struck him. She did not need to. The isolation and total control she exercised were punishment enough. With no one except Margaret, Vance, and occasionally Augustus, who brought supplies but never spoke beyond necessary words, he was allowed contact. What Thomas did not yet understand was that for a specific role, Margaret was preparing him. Not from progressive ideals, but because she needed him to comprehend what would eventually be required, she was educating him. She needed him to understand heredity, to grasp why certain pairings produced certain results, to appreciate the significance of her experiment. Because eventually, when he matured, an active participant in creating what Margaret called her improved line, he would become, not just a subject of observation. Beyond Thomas, the compound held others, though he rarely saw them. Through his window, sometimes he glimpsed people moving between buildings under escort. Voices he heard, occasionally muffled through walls. At night, sometimes there were sounds that disturbed him, crying, screaming, or long silences that felt worse. About these things, he learned never to ask. At any time, approximately 25 people in the compound were maintained by Margaret, though specific individuals changed frequently. Through various means she acquired them, purchasing those with particular characteristics, accepting people other owners wanted to dispose of, occasionally bringing in people from her main plantation when they exhibited traits she wanted to study. In communal rooms, these people lived, sleeping on pallets, given adequate food and shelter, but kept in complete isolation from the outside world. On each person, Margaret maintained detailed records, measurements, health status, family history if known, and specific characteristics she deemed desirable or undesirable. With cold calculation, she arranged pairings, keeping charts that tracked which combinations produced children with which traits. Dozens of births she had documented over 13 years. But something darker was also shown by the records, a high mortality rate, especially among infants, and numerous disappearances. Perhaps the darkest aspect was the truth about these disappearances. When children were born with what Margaret called degenerate characteristics, severe deformities or health problems, they did not survive long. In her records, it was noted they failed to thrive or expired due to natural weakness. But different stories were told by witnesses who came forward after Margaret's death. They described infants taken away shortly after birth and never seen again. They described a small cemetery deep in the pine forest marked only by numbered wooden stakes. They described the copper-lined basement where Margaret preserved biological specimens in alcohol jars, including some that appeared disturbingly human. During his early years, none of this was known by Thomas. Of his room, the schoolroom, the examination room, and occasionally the yard where Margaret allowed him supervised exercise, his world consisted. His health was maintained carefully by her, ensuring adequate nutrition, fresh air, and physical activity. But it was livestock management, not compassion. As Thomas approached his 14th birthday in 1857, new dimensions were taken on by Margaret's lessons. Using anatomical charts and preserved specimens, she began explaining reproductive biology in explicit detail. With clinical precision, she discussed conception, gestation, and birth. With growing emphasis on his unique characteristics, she explained genetic inheritance. "Something remarkable you represent," she told him during one lesson, her eyes studying him with calculating intensity. "Of recessive characteristics, your albinism is a pure expression. Invaluable for understanding hereditary mechanisms would be the offspring if paired correctly with subjects possessing complementary traits. Not simply a subject to be observed are you, Thomas. The key to the next phase of this research, you are." Intelligent enough to understand what she suggested was Thomas, and the knowledge filled him with profound dread. But he had nowhere to run. By miles of forest patrolled by overseers with dogs, the compound was surrounded. Where would an albino teenage boy go in 1857 Georgia even if he escaped? He would be captured immediately, returned, punished severely. As completely as she owned her furniture, Margaret owned him, and the law supported her absolute right to do anything she wanted. But during his recovery from a serious bout of pneumonia in spring 1858, something unexpected occurred. During supply deliveries, Augustus, the driver, began speaking to him. Brief conversations, never more than a few sentences, always when Margaret was absent. How Thomas felt would be asked by Augustus, comment on weather, mention small details about life outside the compound. After years of isolation and clinical treatment, these tiny human connections affected Thomas profoundly. One afternoon in June 1858, as Thomas sat in the yard regaining his strength, supplies were brought by Augustus and he lingered. "You know she won't stop," he said quietly. "She won't stop whatever she's planning. But smarter than most you are. From her books, you've been learning something she can't, maybe you can figure." Before Thomas could respond, away moved Augustus. But in Thomas's mind, the words planted something. For 3 years, passive he had been, accepting his fate because no alternative he saw. But right Augustus was. He could read. To Margaret's library, he had access. About her theories, he understood more than she realized. And if careful, patient, and clever he was, a way to use that knowledge perhaps he could find. As summer arrived and Thomas's health returned, with renewed intensity Margaret resumed her lessons. That the following year, when he turned 15, he would begin the next phase, she informed him. With what she called optimal characteristics, she had identified several women in the compound, and to produce children that could be studied from birth, Thomas would be paired with them. With clinical detachment, she explained this, as if discussing crop rotation rather than the systematic exploitation of a teenage boy. Thomas listened, nodded, and nothing said. But behind his pale eyes, something had changed. A passive subject no longer was he. He was planning. And as he lay in his room each night, that knowledge could be a weapon he began to understand. As part of her experiment, Margaret had educated him, never considering that education might give him tools to resist. A mistake that would eventually unravel everything she had built, it was. An unexpected complication was brought by the autumn of 1858. Unannounced and carrying a letter of introduction from the Medical Society of Charleston, Dr. Harrison Pembroke arrived at Belmont on October 12. A rising figure in Southern medical circles, Pembroke had developed a fascination with hereditary pathologies. Of Margaret's private research facility, he had heard rumors and traveled from South Carolina specifically to meet her. In the main house, Margaret received him, serving tea while assessing this unexpected visitor. 42 years old was Pembroke, tall and thin, with angular features and hands that moved constantly as he spoke. In Philadelphia he had studied medicine before returning to Charleston to establish a practice. But research was his true passion. To Margaret, his published papers on hereditary illness were shown by him, his theories about racial characteristics, his belief that scientific breeding could improve human stock. Not in treating illness after it appears lies the future of medicine, Pembroke explained enthusiastically, but in preventing weak bloodlines from reproducing. Through careful selection, imagine a world where hereditary diseases are eliminated, where stronger than the last is each generation. Through systematic breeding principles, this is achievable. Rapidly, Margaret listened, calculating. Both opportunity and threat was represented by Pembroke. An opportunity because his medical expertise exceeded hers and her research he might advance. A threat because he might discover the full scope of her experiments and with moral objection react. Many physicians espoused eugenic theories abstractly, but at practical applications might balk. Fascinating your ideas are, Dr. Pembroke, she said carefully. Some observations of heredity among the enslaved population here I have maintained. Nothing as systematic as your research, perhaps, but enough to convince me that to human beings do apply animal husbandry principles. Forward leaned Pembroke, eyes bright. Honored I would be to see your work. Perhaps observations that could advance both our studies I might contribute. After a long pause, her decision was made by Margaret. Very well, Doctor. My facility I will show you, but on complete discretion I must insist. Scientifically sound the work is, but the general public lacks education to understand its importance. My word as a gentleman and man of science you have, Pembroke replied solemnly. The following morning, to the compound Margaret led Pembroke. As they walked through Pine Forest, her theories and methods in greater detail than she had ever shared she explained to him. Of controlled breeding, meticulous documentation, attempts to isolate and predict hereditary traits, she described 13 years. With rapt attention Pembroke listened, occasionally interjecting questions that demonstrated his genuine interest and medical knowledge. When they reached the compound, first to the building containing her records Margaret took him. Shelf after shelf of journals, charts, and diagrams documenting births, deaths, measurements, and observations spanning over a decade. With growing excitement, Pembroke examined these. Extraordinary, he murmured, examining a journal from 1847 documenting 3 generations of a family line. Across years, consistency you have maintained. Remarkable is the level of detail. He paused, reading more carefully, though I must say, quite high appears the infant mortality rate, 37% in this cohort alone. This had been anticipated by Margaret. Weak specimens, she replied smoothly, those with obvious deformities or constitutional weaknesses suggesting degenerate heredity. On each case, detailed autopsy records I have maintained. The losses, while regrettable, about which characteristics breed true and which represent hereditary failure, provide valuable data. Slowly Pembroke nodded, though across his face discomfort flickered, but scientific curiosity overrode moral qualms. And specimens you have preserved. Into the copper-lined basement where Margaret maintained her collection, they descended. Lining wooden shelves were rows of glass jars, each containing biological specimens suspended in clear fluid. With professional interest, Pembroke examined them, making notes. Most were organs or tissue samples, but several jars contained small, fully formed bodies, infants no more than a few days old, their tiny faces frozen in expression suggesting they had not died peacefully. Yourself you conducted autopsies? Pembroke asked. From a physician in Savannah initially I had assistants until he passed in 1851. Since then, independently I have performed examinations. Largely self-taught is my anatomical knowledge, but adequate for the purpose. More than adequate, Pembroke straightened, closing his notebook. Mrs. Dunmore, a singular achievement is represented by what you have accomplished here. Remarkable are the scope, duration, and attention to detail. These findings you should publish. Impossible was publication. Margaret shook her head. The public would never understand. Privately to continue research I am content, advancing knowledge for its own sake. Then perhaps we might collaborate, Pembroke suggested. Your data I could analyze, medical expertise contribute, additional studies help design. That would revolutionize understanding of human heredity. With proper methodology, we could produce findings. Carefully, Margaret considered. Shared control and increased risk of exposure meant collaboration. But alluring was the possibility of achieving true scientific breakthrough. The crown jewel of the project, let me show you, she said finally. To Thomas's room she led him. At his table, the boy sat, reading from a medical text. As the door opened, he looked up, pale eyes moving from Margaret to the stranger. 15 years old, Thomas had grown considerably, though thin he remained. Short was his white blonde hair cut, and almost luminous in the afternoon light seemed his pallid skin. Subject 0 This is, Margaret announced with unmistakable pride, a pure albino acquired 4 years ago specifically for this project. Every aspect of his development I have documented, extensive education in anatomy and natural philosophy provided, and his health carefully maintained in preparation for the breeding phase. With undisguised fascination, Pembroke stared. Slowly he approached, and for the next 30 minutes, a thorough examination was conducted while Thomas sat motionless, with passive acceptance learned over years in the compound, enduring the stranger's probing hands. Measured, palpated, looked into Thomas's eyes with various instruments did Pembroke. About health history, vision, sensitivity to sunlight, he asked questions. In a quiet, educated voice that clearly surprised Pembroke, Thomas answered. To speak properly you have taught him, Pembroke observed. And to read, interesting choice. Multiple purposes education serves, Margaret explained. The research significance to understand it allows him, ensuring cooperation. On intellectual capacity of albino subjects, it provides data. And practically, as he matures, to participate effectively, sufficiently he will need to understand breeding protocols. Straightened Pembroke. In breeding protocols participate. As a stud essentially you intend to use him when he reaches appropriate maturity. Yes. 15 he is now. Within 6 months, the breeding phase I plan to begin, with carefully selected women pairing him to produce offspring that can be studied from conception through development. Poorly understood is the hereditary transmission of albinism. By controlling parentage and documenting results across multiple pairings, whether it breeds true and what other characteristics are linked to it we can determine. For the first time, genuinely uncomfortable looked Pembroke. From Margaret to Thomas and back his eyes moved. Still quite young he is. Throughout the South, enslaved boys his age father children regularly, Margaret replied coolly. Nothing unusual in this there is. And unlike field workers forced into casual unions, for scientific purposes, in controlled documented breeding subject 0 will participate. Entirely different is the context. For a long moment, nothing was said by Pembroke. Scientific enthusiasm warring with residual moral sense, but that intellectual ambition would win, Margaret had calculated correctly. That offspring will be properly documented, what assurances do I have, he finally asked. Much value loses the data without complete records from conception through maturity. For 13 years, such records I have maintained, Margaret said. Relaxing standards now I have no intention of. Every conception will be documented, every pregnancy monitored, in detail every birth recorded. Here children will be raised where development can be observed systematically. To all records, complete access you will have. Then your offer of collaboration I accept, Pembroke said. Monthly I can visit to conduct examinations and contribute medical expertise. In exchange, that I receive credit when these findings are eventually published, I ask only. On the arrangement, they shook hands. In silence, Thomas watched this exchange, with perfect clarity understanding that his fate had just been sealed. That Margaret might postpone or abandon her plans, the one hope he had harbored, evaporated. From a respected physician, she had found validation, who not only accepted her work, but to participate wanted. No reprieve there would be. After Pembroke departed that evening, Thomas's room was visited by Margaret. "With our work, Dr. Pembroke is impressed," she said. "Significant scientific breakthrough we are on the verge of, he believes. Privileged you should feel to participate in research of such importance." Silent remained Thomas. "Your cooperation I expect," Margaret continued, voice hardening. "Advantages no enslaved person could dream of, you have been given: education, adequate food and shelter, protection from fieldwork brutalities. In your development, considerable resources I have invested. The purpose for which you were acquired, the time has come for you to fulfill." "Still, nothing," said Thomas. Briefly Margaret studied him, then left, behind her locking the door. In darkness, finally himself to feel the full weight of despair allowed Thomas. 15 years old he was, utterly alone, trapped in a nightmare that presented itself as science. And now, everything Margaret believed had been validated by a respected physician, ensuring the horror would continue and escalate. But Margaret's books for 4 years Thomas had spent reading, her theories studying, understanding how she thought, and something neither Margaret nor Pembroke seemed to recognize, he had begun noticing. About heredity, their grand theories, their predictions about which traits would appear in offspring were wrong more often than right. Disappointing results were shown by Margaret's charts: children who did not match predictions, characteristics that appeared or disappeared without explanation. To insufficient data or hidden hereditary factors, Margaret attributed failures. But Thomas, the same books reading, the same theories understanding, had begun suspecting something more fundamental, that far more complex than anyone yet understood was heredity, and that Margaret's confidence in controlling and predicting it was a delusion. Something he had not had before, this insight gave him hope. Not hope for escape, which seemed impossible, but hope that on its own terms, Margaret's experiment might fail, that so inconsistent results might prove that even she would be forced to acknowledge limitations. Thin hope it was, dependent on outcomes years in the future. But it was something. And as Thomas lay in his narrow bed that October night, a silent vow was made by him. With Margaret's demands he would cooperate because no choice he had. But he would watch, learn, and remember, and if long enough he survived, as he suspected it would, if Margaret's experiment eventually unraveled, he would make certain the world knew what happened in this hidden place. On November 18, 1858, Harrison Pembroke returned to Belmont, carrying medical instruments, journals, and supplies he deemed necessary for what he called proper scientific documentation of the breeding phase. Warmly Margaret received him, relieved to have found not just a collaborator, but someone who shared her vision completely. For Pembroke's visit, Thomas had been prepared. In clinical detail what would be expected had been explained by Margaret, using anatomical charts and breeding manuals to illustrate procedures. 3 women from the compound's population had been selected by her, all in their late teens or early 20s, all exhibiting what she called optimal physical characteristics. Their documentation was shown to Thomas, detailed measurements, family histories, health assessments. That with each woman in succession he would be paired, that closely conceptions and pregnancies would be monitored, that for systematic study, resulting children would remain in the compound, she explained. With his face carefully blank, Thomas listened, nothing of the revulsion and terror inside revealing. Understood he that resistance was impossible. Over everyone in the compound, absolute power was exercised by Margaret, and medical authority to her commands was added by Pembroke's participation. Eliza was the name of the first woman selected by Margaret. 19 she was, tall and slender, with features Margaret's records described as refined type, suggesting mixed heredity favorable for observing albinism transmission. For 2 years at the compound Eliza had been, taken from Belmont's main plantation after giving birth to a child Margaret wanted to study. That child, a daughter, shortly after birth had been removed. Again, Eliza never saw her. Withdrawn and deeply traumatized left her the experience, though Margaret's notes characterized her simply as compliant subject with minimal resistance. To Thomas's room on a cold November afternoon, Margaret brought Eliza. Outside, Pembroke waited, ready to enter after what Margaret estimated would be sufficient time. To both what was expected she explained, her voice carrying no more emotion than if instructing servants on housekeeping. Then she left them alone, from outside locking the door. For a long time, neither moved nor spoke. On opposite sides of the small room, they stood, two terrified young people trapped in a nightmare. To escape, power had neither. Finally, the silence was broken by Eliza. "You I know," she said softly. "From the window sometimes, I seen you. The white boy she keeps locked up. Long as me been here, maybe longer." Nodded Thomas. "For years." "What she make you do?" "Study, read her books, learn about." Helplessly at the anatomical charts on the wall, he gestured. "This." To the window moved Eliza. "A girl was my baby. Pretty little thing. That same night, Mrs. Dunor took her away. The baby died, she told me, but for days after in some other part of the building, I heard her crying. Then nothing no more I didn't hear." Drained of emotion by grief too large to fully express, her voice was flat. "That baby really died, you think?" What truth would be kinder, Thomas did not answer because he did not know. Instead, he said, "I'm sorry." To look at him turned Eliza, her eyes holding depths of sorrow. "You and me, no choices here we got. Us she owns. Whatever she want, she can make us do. So what she say I guess we do and maybe we survive. That's all there is." What happened next in that locked room will not be described in detail because some horrors need not be rendered explicit to be understood. Enough it is to say that two young people stripped of all agency tried to retain some shred of dignity in an utterly degrading situation. When an hour later, Margaret unlocked the door, followed by Pembroke carrying medical instruments, in ways that would haunt them for whatever remained of their lives, both Thomas and Eliza had been changed. Of Eliza, an examination that was invasive and humiliating was conducted by Pembroke, with clinical precision everything in his notebook documenting. As if Eliza were not present, findings with Margaret he discussed, using medical terminology that dehumanized her completely. Then her he dismissed, and to her sleeping quarters she was escorted. Remained Thomas, and to similar examination and questioning he was subjected by Pembroke, about his physical response, emotional state, and comprehension of what had occurred, observations recording. This process with the second woman, Sarah, on November 25, Margaret and Pembroke repeated. 18 was Sarah, at the compound only 6 months, purchased from a plantation near Augusta because Margaret's records indicated desirable hereditary traits. Unlike Eliza, whose trauma produced resignation, as rage manifested Sarah's. When what would be required was explained by Margaret, outright refused Sarah, voice shaking with fury and fear. "You can beat me, sell me, kill me," Sarah said, "but this I ain't doing. Right, this ain't, and it you know. To refuse, no right you have." Margaret remained unmoved. "For this purpose, property purchased specifically you are. Your cooperation is required. Then force me you're going to have to." To the overseer, Margaret nodded. "To the isolation room, take her. No food until she reconsiders." In a small windowless basement room, Sarah was locked, receiving only water and a single small piece of bread daily. There for 6 days she remained. On the second day, if she had reconsidered, Margaret visited to ask. Weakened but defiant, Sarah refused. On the 4th day, with Pembroke Margaret visited, who in medical terms the damage prolonged starvation would cause explained, emphasizing permanent harm she was inflicting on herself through pointless resistance. Wept Sarah, but did not relent. On the 6th day, a different approach was taken by Margaret. To the isolation room, Eliza she brought and what had happened made her describe, emphasizing that Eliza had survived, had not been physically harmed, that without changing the outcome, continued resistance would only prolong Sarah's suffering. Exhausted and broken, Eliza delivered this message as instructed, though her voice carried an apology Margaret had not scripted. Finally surrendered Sarah. To walk, 2 weeks she was, so to Thomas's room she was carried by the overseer where the process was repeated. With clinical detachment, everything was documented by Pembroke, noting that subject's physical condition compromised by resistance period, recommend improved nutritional preparation for future pairings. What happened to Sarah witnessed by the third woman, Hannah, and when her turn came in early December, no resistance was offered by her. 21 she was, at the compound for 3 years, and that survival meant absolute submission, long ago she had learned. With everything Margaret demanded, she complied, her face an expressionless mask, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the walls. Afterward, with satisfaction Pembroke noted that subject demonstrated optimal compliance, suggesting effective conditioning protocols. In a state of numb dissociation, Thomas endured these weeks. Each night, locked in his room, at the ceiling he stared and tried to separate his mind from his body to preserve some core of self that remained untouched by what Margaret forced him to do. Obsessively he read, losing himself in breeding charts and anatomical diagrams, anything to avoid thinking. And whenever he had access, Margaret's records carefully he watched, noting growing discrepancies between her predictions and actual results from previous experiments. Margaret, meanwhile, was triumphant. With Subject 0, the breeding phase she had successfully initiated, with Pembroke's assistance every detail documenting. Conception probabilities she calculated, gestation periods estimated, for the pregnancies she anticipated, observation protocols planned. In her journal, extensive entries she wrote predicting that unprecedented insights into albinism inheritance would be provided by offspring. But its own plans had nature. Of the 3 women, only Eliza conceived. By trauma and harsh conditions stressed, Sarah and Hannah's bodies, despite repeated pairings in subsequent months, did not support conception. To constitutional weakness, Margaret attributed this, noting it as data supporting her theories. That profound trauma might affect fertility, she did not consider or chose not to acknowledge. With obsessive attention, Eliza's pregnancy was monitored. Weekly they examined her, Margaret and Pembroke, her abdomen measuring, to the fetal heartbeat listening, every aspect of gestation documenting. Predictions they discussed. Albinism would the child show? What would the skin color be? The eye color? With scientific enthusiasm, these questions they debated, apparently blind to Eliza's growing despair as her pregnancy advanced. From his window or during brief periods when compound residents were allowed in the yard, occasionally Thomas saw Eliza. Through winter into spring, her belly grew. Heavily, slowly she moved, her face drawn with exhaustion and something deeper. Once across the yard their eyes met, and grief so profound that it stopped his breath was seen by Thomas. Before it was even born, her child she was mourning, knowing what fate awaited any baby born in this place. As Eliza's due date approached in May 1859, with additional supplies Margaret prepared the compound's medical room. Over the years, numerous babies in the compound she had delivered, and with particular anticipation she approached this birth. To be present, Pembroke arranged, bringing specialized instruments and promising to conduct immediate examination of the newborn to document initial characteristics. On May 17, 1859, the birth happened. After 18 hours of labor, throughout attended by Margaret and Pembroke, treating Eliza's suffering as an inconvenient but necessary aspect of data collection. When finally emerged the baby, a girl weighing just over 6 pounds, not to comfort the exhausted mother, but to examine the infant's skin and eyes under bright lamplight was Margaret's first action. Not albino was the baby. Light brown was her skin, dark her eyes, black her hair. Vigorously crying when his examination was conducted by Pembroke, entirely healthy she appeared. Visible disappointment was Margaret's initial reaction. After 4 years of preparation, selecting, and educating Subject 0, carefully orchestrating this breeding experiment, in the first offspring had not appeared the primary characteristic she had hoped to study. Recessive trait, Pembroke observed, making notes. As expected, requires both parents to carry the characteristic. Obviously does not carry albinism genes the mother, therefore normal pigmentation shows offspring. To isolate the recessive expression, multiple generations and careful selection we would need. Nodded Margaret, her mind already calculating next steps. With his own female offspring, subject 0 will need to be paired. That is the only way to increase probability of albino expression in subsequent generations once they reach maturity. Generation 1, female 1 will be designated this child. When approximately 15 years of age she reaches, back to subject 0 she will be bred. On the birthing bed, lying exhausted, Eliza overheard this conversation. Even through her pain and fatigue, clear enough were the implications. Her daughter they intended to take, in this compound raise her, and eventually into the same nightmare Eliza had endured, force her. From Eliza, a sound that was not quite a scream, not quite a sob, but something more primal, a sound of absolute despair that would haunt Thomas, who from his locked room heard it for the rest of his life, was produced by the realization. To nurse the baby for 1 week allowed Margaret Eliza, long enough to establish feeding. Then on May 24th, the infant was removed and to a separate room taken where a wet nurse, another enslaved woman, would provide care under Margaret's supervision. To the general population of the compound, Eliza was returned, her body still recovering from birth, her arms empty, because she had no baby to feed, her milk drying painfully. After that week in May, into a strange, tense quiet fell the compound. Almost entirely ceased the sounds from other buildings. Subdued seemed even Margaret, though her routines she maintained and with mechanical precision continued documenting observations. Shifted had something. Broken had some balance, though exactly what, Thomas could not identify. What no one knew was that during that week when she was allowed to hold her daughter, a decision had been made by Eliza. From love so fierce that it manifested as terrible action, a decision born. On the 6th night, when complete was darkness and quiet was the compound, something that ensured her daughter would never be used in Margaret Dunour's experiment was done by Eliza. The next morning, both of them were found by the wet nurse. Around the tiny body that had ceased breathing sometime in the night, wrapped Eliza's arms. Never recorded were the details, never documented the method. Simply in her records noted Margaret, Generation 1 female 1 expired due to unknown cause. Subject Eliza subsequently disposed of as unreliable for further breeding protocols. Never explained in the documents was what disposed of meant, but after that day, never seen again in the compound was Eliza. And in the small cemetery deep in the pine forest, digging 2 graves that week in May was remembered by a witness who came forward decades later, not one. A larger grave and a smaller one, marked only with wooden stakes that eventually rotted away, leaving no trace that either of them had ever existed. To Chatham County, the summer of 1859 brought stifling heat, and with it came an unexpected visitor who would change everything. On July 8, Dr. Samuel Hargrave from Atlanta arrived at Belmont, accompanied by a young medical assistant named Robert Chen. After reading one of Pembroke's published papers that made vague references to systematic hereditary studies being conducted in Georgia, with Margaret about her research Hargrave had corresponded. Intrigued, to visit Hargrave had written to Margaret requesting permission, and she had agreed, hoping to replace the increasingly unreliable Pembroke with a more stable collaborator. 24 years old was Robert Chen, the son of immigrants who had come to San Francisco during the gold rush before eventually settling in Georgia. For a book on human anatomical variation across different populations, with research he was assisting Hargrave. With professional curiosity, Chen approached the visit to Belmont, expecting to see interesting documentation of hereditary patterns. What he found instead would haunt him for the rest of his life. The same tour she had given Pembroke was given to them by Margaret, the records room with its shelves of journals and charts, the basement with its preserved specimens, and finally the introduction to Subject 0. But where Pembroke had responded with scientific enthusiasm tempered by growing unease, immediate and visceral horror was Chen's reaction. As her methods were explained by Margaret, detailing the forced pairings, the systematic breeding, the high infant mortality rate, progressively paler grew Chen's face. When her plans to breed Thomas with his own offspring once they matured were described by her, no longer silent could remain Chen. "Mrs. Dunor," he said carefully, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion, "what you describe is not research. Systematic brutality it is. Human beings these are, not livestock. Such violations of human dignity, no scientific knowledge could justify." Stiffened Margaret, her face re-eaning. "Young you are and influenced by sentimental notions that have no place in scientific inquiry. Enslaved people these are, legally my property, whose reproduction I control absolutely under the law. To advance human knowledge, that legal authority I am using. Irrelevant are your moral objections. Morality the law does not determine," Chen replied steadily, "despite the danger of contradicting a wealthy woman in her own home. Profoundly wrong can still be what is legal. Wrong is what you are doing here, Mrs. Dunor. Harshly history will judge this." To mediate attempted Hargrave, but would not be silenced Chen. "That justifies treating human beings as breeding stock, there is no theoretical framework. Enough I have seen. In this I will not participate in you, Dr. Hargrave, to withdraw as well I strongly advise." Immediately off her property, Margaret ordered both men. Within the hour they departed, though not before a brief interaction that would prove significant was had by Chen. While waiting for Hargrave to collect his belongings, down the hallway where Thomas's room was located wandered Chen. Through the door's small window, the pale boy sitting at his table, reading was seen by him. As unbearably sad, something about the scene struck Chen. Softly on the door he knocked. Up looked Thomas, startled. Never knocked visitors. Cautiously he approached the door. "What is your name?" Chen asked through the window. "Thomas, sir." "How long have you been here?" 5 years, sir." "Do you want to leave?" So unexpected was the question that how to answer did not know Thomas. After a long pause, simply he said, "Yes." Nodded Chen, committing the boy's face to memory. "You I will remember, Thomas. I will remember, I promise." Then for him called Hargrave, and Chen had to leave. Through the window, as the two men departed, watched Thomas. The significance of that exchange, he did not understand, but something in Chen's eyes planted a seed of hope. During their journey back to Atlanta, Chen and Hargrave argued. Using scientific rationalization, Margaret's work Hargrave tried to defend, but eventually wore him down Chen's moral certainty. By the time they reached Atlanta, that what happened at Belmont crossed ethical lines, reluctantly agreed Hargrave, though against Margaret to take action he refused. No such hesitation had Chen. Within days of returning to Atlanta, to medical societies, abolitionist organizations, and newspapers describing what he had witnessed at Belmont in carefully detailed terms, letters he began writing. Everything he documented, the forced breeding, the preserved infant specimens, the systematic exploitation, and most importantly, Thomas, the albino boy, locked in a room and being prepared for breeding experiments he described. Not what Chen hoped was the response. In late 1859, with sectional tensions building toward war, unwilling were most institutions to investigate the internal operations of a Georgia plantation, especially on the word of a young Chinese medical assistant making extraordinary claims against a wealthy white woman. For his concern thanked him the medical societies, but no action took. His accounts to publish declined the newspapers, citing lack of corroborating evidence. Though sympathetic, even abolitionist groups had limited resources. Frustrated but undeterred, a decision that would prove fateful was made by Chen. On December 12, 1859, just days after John Brown's execution sent shock waves through the South, back to Chatham County traveled Chen. Directly he did not approach Belmont. Instead, people in the area quietly interviewing he began. Drivers, tradesmen, overseers from other plantations, free blacks in Savannah, who might have heard rumors from enslaved people at Belmont. Slowly, carefully, testimonies that corroborated his observations he assembled. Of Chen's investigation in late December learned Margaret, when an overseer from a neighboring plantation mentioned that a Chinese man had been asking questions about Belmont's slave population. Immediately understood Margaret the threat. For 14 years, through isolation, intimidation, and the general unwillingness of anyone to interfere with a plantation owner's business, her compound in secrecy she had maintained. But something new represented Chen, an outsider with no financial stake in the system, no social connection to Georgia's plantation society, and a moral conviction strong enough to override practical concerns. Calculated and ruthless was Margaret's response. Simply have Chen killed she could not. Exactly the attention she needed to avoid would attract his disappearance. Instead, evidence-destroying she began. The most damning details containing journals she burned, the most disturbing preserved specimens disposed of, and by selling people to distant plantations where they could not easily be questioned, the compound's population reduced. Most significantly, to relocate Thomas entirely, possibly to property she owned in Alabama, preparations she made. But a critical error had been made by Margaret. In her haste to eliminate evidence, for Augustus, her longtime driver, who had witnessed 14 years of horror at Belmont, and had finally reached his breaking point, she failed to account. In the forest, Eliza and her baby buried had been seen by Augustus. To the compound, countless people who were never seen again he had transported. For Margaret's experiments, supplies he had delivered and remained silent because he believed no choice he had. But something he had not had before gave him Chen's investigation, hope that someone might actually listen. On January 15, 1860, with Chen through an intermediary in Savannah, contact was made by Augustus. Secretly in a warehouse near the docks they met. And everything he knew was told by Augustus to Chen. The hidden compound he described, the forced breeding, the high mortality rate, the cemetery in the forest with its numbered stakes. Of people who had disappeared, names he provided, dates when they had been taken to the compound, about Margaret's methods and her obsessive documentation, details. Most importantly, a map showing the location of the compound was drawn by him and how to access it without being detected was described. Now had Chen corroborating testimony from someone who had been inside Belmont for years. Exactly what he needed to force authorities to act it was. To Savannah he traveled and to the county sheriff, a man named William Pritchard, his evidence he presented. Everything he laid out, his own observations, Augustus' testimony, the physical evidence that still existed at the compound despite Margaret's destruction efforts. In a difficult position was Pritchard. Wealthy, influential, and well-connected was Margaret Dunor. From a Chinese medical assistant and an enslaved driver, based on accusations investigating her could end his career if the charges proved false or exaggerated. But detailed and specific was Chen's documentation, and if even half of what he alleged was true, without becoming complicit, ignore it he could not. On January 23, 1860, at Belmont arrived Sheriff Pritchard, accompanied by 2 deputies and Robert Chen, with a court order to inspect the compound. At the main house, Margaret met them, her face a mask of cold fury, but a court order she could not refuse. Down the narrow road through the pine forest to the hidden buildings she led them, and what they found there confirmed Chen's worst descriptions. To just 8 people had been reduced the compound population, all appearing malnourished and traumatized. Largely emptied had been the records room, with ash still visible in the fireplace where journals had been burned by Margaret. But everything she had not destroyed. Remained Pembroke's detailed medical notes, with clinical precision documenting forced pairings and pregnancy observations. Dozens of preserved specimens still contained the basement, including several that were clearly human infants. And most damning, Thomas they found, locked in his room, 15 years old, and exactly what had happened to him over the past 5 years able to articulate. Horrified was Pritchard. Evidence of harsh treatment he had expected to find, perhaps some questionable breeding practices, but for the systematic nature of Margaret's experiment, nothing had prepared him. Under house arrest pending formal charges he placed Margaret and ordered the compound closed. While authorities determined their legal status, temporarily in the county poorhouse were placed the 8 remaining residents. Because of his unique circumstances and ability to testify, under the protection of the court was placed Thomas. Immediate and characteristically calculated was Margaret's response. The best lawyers money could buy were hired by her, men who had built careers defending plantation owners against accusations of cruelty. Simple was their strategy. Under Georgia law, legal was everything Margaret had done. Property were enslaved people. Over their reproduction, living conditions, and treatment, absolute discretion had owners. Everything Chen and Pritchard accused her of doing, explicitly the law gave Margaret the right to do. The forced breeding, the medical experiments, even the high infant mortality rate were all within her legal rights as a property owner. A defense that would likely succeed it was. In 1860 Georgia, for actions that were technically legal, no jury would convict a wealthy white woman, no matter how morally repugnant. Knew this Chen. Knew this Pritchard. And knew this Margaret's lawyers. Before it ever reached trial, likely dismissed would be the case. But then something unexpected happened that changed everything. Harrison Pembroke, the physician who had collaborated with Margaret for over a year, came forward. In Charleston he had been living, drinking heavily, consumed by guilt over his participation in the experiment. When of the investigation he learned, something broke inside him. On February 8, 1860, to Savannah traveled Pembroke in testimony that corroborated every detail of Chen's accusations provided. More importantly, as a respected white physician, weight that Chen's and Augustus did not carried his testimony. In graphic detail, the forced pairings were described by Pembroke. Dates, names, and specific medical observations he provided. His own participation he admitted and profound remorse expressed. Clearly he stated that what happened at Belmont was not legitimate research, but systematic brutality disguised as science. Devastating was his testimony, and from someone the court could not easily dismiss it came. With Pembroke's testimony added to the evidence, much stronger became the case against Margaret. But their strategy adapted Margaret's lawyers. They argued that even if everything alleged was true, under Georgia law, a crime it still did not constitute. To dismiss all charges, they were preparing to file motions when events outside Chatham County intervened in ways no one could have predicted. Just when we thought we understood the full scope of Margaret Dunner's experiments, something even more disturbing was uncovered by the investigation. If this dark journey into one of Georgia's most suppressed historical horrors you have been following, this is the moment when everything unravels. That like button hit if this story has kept you on the edge of your seat. Share it with someone who appreciates true historical mysteries, and so you do not miss the conclusion, make sure you are subscribed. Now, how the truth about Belmont finally came to light, let me tell you, though not in any way that would bring real justice. In March 1860, as Margaret's lawyers maneuvered to have all charges dismissed, one final effort to expose the full scope of the Belmont horrors was made by Chen. One persistent question that no one had adequately answered, he had been investigating: what happened to all the people who had disappeared from the compound over 14 years? A cemetery in the forest with numbered wooden stakes had been mentioned by Augustus, but how many graves it contained, close enough to determine he had never been allowed. On March 14, 1860, accompanied by Sheriff Pritchard and 2 deputies, Chen searched the pine forest behind the compound until the cemetery Augustus had described was found by them. Far worse than anyone had imagined was what they discovered. Mostly rotted away had the wooden stakes, but careful examination of the ground revealed disturbances indicating at least 47 separate grave sites. 47 people buried in unmarked graves in a hidden cemetery. Their deaths never reported, their names never recorded in any official document. To determine cause of death, excavations of several graves were ordered by Pritchard. Horrifying was what they found. Multiple infant remains, some showing signs of physical deformities, others appearing entirely healthy. Several adult remains that forensic examination suggested had died of malnutrition or untreated illness. And most disturbing, 3 adult remains that showed evidence of violence, broken bones that had never healed, skull fractures, injuries that could not have been accidental. Everything changed this discovery. That breeding enslaved people was legal, that high infant mortality was unfortunate but not criminal, could be argued by Margaret. But murder was murder, regardless of the victim's legal status. That some people in the compound had not simply died from neglect or harsh conditions was suggested by the evidence of violence in those graves. They had been killed. When confronted with this evidence, that she had no knowledge of any violence was maintained by Margaret. That if anyone had been killed, it must have been the work of overseers acting without her authorization or conflicts among the enslaved people themselves, she claimed. That without witnesses or documentation proving Margaret personally committed or ordered any killings, the murder charges could not be sustained, argued her lawyers. But for one person, Margaret had not accounted. Hannah, the third woman forced to pair with Thomas, who through absolute submission had survived the experiment. One of the 8 people removed from the compound when it was closed had been Hannah. During initial questioning, silent she had remained, traumatized and afraid. But when about the cemetery and the evidence of violence she learned, something shifted in her. On March 22, 1860, with testimony that would finally break through Margaret's legal defenses, forward came Hannah. Personally administering poison to an infant who had been born with severe deformities was witnessed by Hannah, she described. A woman who had refused breeding protocols, seeing Margaret strike, hitting her with such force that the woman collapsed and never regained consciousness was described by her. A man who had become too ill to be useful for breeding experiments, Margaret ordering an overseer to dispose of was described by her. Dates, names, and specific details that could be corroborated against the grave sites and Margaret's remaining records were provided by Hannah. At tremendous personal risk was given Hannah's testimony. As an enslaved woman testifying against a white property owner, in Georgia courts no legal standing she had. Normally inadmissible would be her testimony, but unusual enough were the circumstances and compelling enough the physical evidence that into the record her testimony to be entered was allowed by the judge, though that it could not alone support a conviction, he made clear. Viciously, Hannah's credibility was attacked by Margaret's lawyers, arguing that enslaved people routinely lied to harm their owners, that by resentment over being used in breeding experiments, Hannah's testimony was motivated, that nothing she said could be trusted. Through March and into April 1860 dragged the legal battle with both sides marshalling evidence and expert testimony. And then on April 12, 1861, on Fort Sumter Confederate forces fired and the Civil War began. Within weeks, the war effort shifted all attention in Georgia. Through the legal system slowly grinding, Margaret's case was indefinitely postponed. For military service was called up Sheriff Pritchard. To serve as a military advisor left the judge hearing the case. As staff enlisted or fled, closed the county records office which had been compiling evidence. Under house arrest, but no longer actively prosecuted, Margaret saw an opportunity. In June 1861, to a consortium of investors from Savannah, Belmont was sold by Margaret, claiming she needed to relocate for health reasons. All property except the compound buildings which between April and May Margaret had quietly dismantled was included in the sale. Burning what could be burned, burying what could be buried, scattering the evidence across the property. No interest in the compound had the buyers. Only the productive farmland they wanted. To Alabama to a small property near Mobile relocated Margaret and from public record disappeared. In 1863 when a neighbor reported seeing an enormously obese woman living alone in a rundown house on the outskirts of Mobile was the last confirmed sighting of her. After that, nothing. During the war years she may have died or relocated further west or simply vanished into the chaos of a collapsing Confederacy. Never filed was a death certificate. Never identified was a grave. Simply ceased to exist in any official record after 1863 did Margaret Dunor. A different fate had Thomas, the boy at the center of Margaret's experiment. When the compound was closed in January 1860, under court protection he had been placed. Feeling personally responsible for Thomas's welfare, Robert Chin, for him to be housed temporarily with a Quaker family in Savannah arranged, who opposed slavery and during the legal proceedings agreed to care for him. When the war started and Margaret's case was postponed, with this family remained Thomas. With genuine kindness, the first he had experienced since being sold at age 11, treated him the Quakers, a couple named Daniel and Abigail Hargrove. His education they continued, practical skills taught him, and most importantly, as a human being rather than a specimen treated him. In 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. Thomas was legally free. Though complicated were the practicalities of freedom for a 17-year-old albino boy in the middle of a war zone, through the war and Reconstruction, with the Hargrove family remained Thomas. Carpentry he learned and skilled enough to support himself became. In 1869, at age 23, a free woman of color named Rebecca Williams he married, and together they had 3 children. None of the children showed albinism. Healthy all were and lived to adulthood. As a carpenter in Savannah for over 30 years, Thomas worked, a quiet life living and rarely about his years at Belmont speaking except to his wife who he trusted completely. His medical career continued Robert Chen, but fundamentally changed him the experience at Belmont. His research into anatomical variation he abandoned and instead on public health focused, working to improve medical care for poor communities in Atlanta. With Thomas for over 20 years, correspondence he maintained. And in his private journals, about the ethical responsibilities of physicians and the dangers of scientific rationalization for cruelty, extensively he wrote. In 1892 at age 57 he died, still haunted by what he had seen in that compound. From his guilt over participating in Margaret's experiments, never recovered Harrison Pembroke. In Charleston he continued practicing medicine, but heavily he drank and deteriorated his mental health. In 1867, by overdose of laudanum, suicide he committed, behind a note that referenced unforgivable sins committed in the name of science leaving. His medical notes from Belmont, which had been entered as evidence in Margaret's case, by the court sealed were supposed to be, but to the court records never returned were they. Sometime during the chaos of war and Reconstruction, they disappeared. The driver who had finally broken silence and provided testimony that started the investigation, Augustus, lived until 1879. After the war, in Chatham County he remained, working as a freight driver. For being quiet and sad he was known, rarely smiling, as if weight that never lightened he carried. At approximately 60 years old he died, his grave marked with a simple stone that gave no hint of the courage it had taken for him to speak up against Margaret Dunmore. As for the 8 people removed from the compound in January 1860, varied their fates. During the war years some died. Into the chaos of Reconstruction some disappeared. At least 2, including Hannah, in the Savannah area remained and lived into the 1870s. Never married Hannah and had no children. As a seamstress she worked and alone lived. In her neighborhood as a woman who seemed perpetually sad but was kind to children, known. In 1876 she died and at her request under her real name, Hannah Freeman, in a cemetery for free blacks in Savannah she was buried. Still exists her gravestone, which bears the inscription, "She survived what should have killed her." Multiple times between 1861 and 1959 changed hands the property where Belmont stood. In 1883, cause unknown, burned the main house. For various purposes the land was used, farming, timber harvesting, briefly as a hunting preserve. Largely forgotten became the compound area deep in the pine forest. Over the cleared areas, trees grew. With its wooden stakes long rotted away, the cemetery became indistinguishable from surrounding forest floor. In 1959, through the former Belmont property, a new highway that would cut construction approved the state of Georgia. During initial surveying in March 1959, the foundation of one of the compound buildings were discovered by construction workers. Inside a sealed cavity in the foundation wall, a leather-bound journal, remarkably well preserved due to being completely sealed away from moisture and air, was found by them. One of Margaret Dunmore's records from the Purification Project was the journal. Hidden rather than burned it had been, possibly as insurance or perhaps simply overlooked in Margaret's hasty destruction of evidence in 1861. The years 1855 through 1859 were covered by the journal and of Thomas's acquisition, education, and eventual use in breeding experiments, detailed documentation contained. Measurements, observations, predictions, and chillingly clinical descriptions of the forced pairings it included. To the County Historical Society, the journal was brought by the construction workers who found it. Uncertain what they had discovered. Horrified were the Historical Society staff who first read it. State authorities they contacted, and to the Georgia State Archives, the journal was eventually turned over. Comparing the journal's contents against other historical records, census data, and court documents from the 1860 case against Margaret Dunmore, a brief investigation was conducted. That everything in the journal appeared to be authentic was confirmed by the investigation. Known events matched the dates. From the court records matched the names referenced in the journal. The foundation remains being uncovered by highway construction matched physical descriptions of the compound. But something disturbing was also revealed by the investigation. To suppress information about the Belmont case even after the war, a systematic effort there had been. Supposedly during the war, partially destroyed had been court records from Margaret's 1860 prosecution, though some documents seem to have been removed deliberately rather than lost to military action. Almost nothing about the case contained newspaper archives from Savannah in 1860 despite it involving sensational allegations against a wealthy plantation owner. That even after Margaret fled, to minimize public knowledge of what happened, her family's wealth and influence had been used, it appeared. As a historically significant document, the Georgia State Archives classified the journal, but for 10 years until 1969, public access to it restricted, citing concerns about privacy and the sensitive nature of the content. When to researchers it was finally made available in 1969, from historians studying slavery, medical ethics, and eugenics in antebellum America, attention it attracted. Analyzing Margaret's experiment as an example of how eugenic thinking manifested in the antebellum South, several academic papers were published. A teaching example in medical ethics courses, illustrating the dangers of scientific rationalization for cruelty, the case became. But largely ignored at mainstream historical narratives. Too disturbing it was, too complicated, too uncomfortable to fit into simplified stories about antebellum Georgia. Through news coverage in 1969, about the journal's discovery learned Thomas's descendants, who still lived in the Savannah area. In 1902 at age 56 had died Thomas, having lived long enough to see his grandchildren born and his children grown. To his wife Rebecca most of what happened at Belmont he had told, and some of it she had told their children, though protecting them from the worst details. When the journal was made public, in their 50s and 60s were Thomas's grandchildren, and what their grandfather had endured, the full scope they finally understood. Whether to speak publicly about their connection to the case, debated the family, but ultimately decided against it. In Savannah established they were, despite the barriers faced by African Americans in the Jim Crow South, good lives had built, and that association with such a notorious case might bring unwanted attention or harm feared. Of Thomas's history, private family knowledge they maintained, but to public discussions of the Belmont case did not contribute. Despite the discovery, continued the highway construction. By archaeologists, the compound foundations were documented, then destroyed to make way for the road. Within the highway right-of-way was the cemetery area and more thoroughly was excavated. Of 61 individuals, remains were ultimately recovered, including children and adults ranging from infants to elderly. In a single plot in a Savannah cemetery, all were reinterred, with a stone that reads, "In memory of those who suffered at Belmont Plantation 1842 to 1860. May they rest in peace and never be forgotten," marked. This mystery to us shows how easily profound cruelty can be justified by scientific language, how against the powerless, legal authority can be wielded as a weapon, and how the most vulnerable, institutions can fail to protect. An aberration was not Margaret Dunmore's experiment. Of attitudes and practices that were widely accepted in her time, an extreme example it was. That enslaved people could be treated as property, that reproduction could be controlled and manipulated, that any method justified scientific advancement. These ideas were not unique to Margaret. Only its systematic nature and eventual exposure made her case unusual. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Margaret Dunmore escaped justice? Or did her guilt pursue her into whatever fate she met after 1863? Below, leave your comment and your thoughts share. If compelling you found this tale and more dark historical mysteries like this you want to Liturgy of Fear, subscribe. That notification bell hit, and this video with someone who appreciates stories that illuminate the darkest corners of American history share. For listening, thank you, and remember, often those that really happened are the most terrifying horrors. In the next video, see you.